Good morning, everyone. What I've got for you today is an example of the first scrape that I do on a bassoon reed after it's been opened for the very first time. So the reed that I've got here is brand new. Not brand new in terms of being formed. You can see my system for labeling my blanks here when I pull them out of my humidified box is year and number of reed for the year. So this was actually made in 2020. It was the 19th reed that I made for the year. So that doesn't mean I've only used 18 reeds this year. It means that I was working on stockpiles from previous years leading up to now. So I'm about 20 reeds into the year, and this is what we've got. So this reed was actually made in Iowa, so it's been curing in a humidifier box, so like a cigar box that I purchased with a little gauge inside of it. And it's been 19 reeds. I would have made that probably about in January sometime. It was probably a winter break project. And so one of the first things that I'll check before I open is just to make sure that the size of the butt of the reed and the throat is the shape that I want it to be, especially after it's kind of been sitting for a while and I moved across the country. So that makes a big change in the cane. And so I'll actually just check this for fitting on the bocal. I've got my mandrel marked to a certain point, and I can see that it's shrunk just a little bit, or it's a little bit smaller than I would like it. So at this point I'll ream, and I ream with just a drill bit. So I've got some specifics uploaded on my website for different tools that I use, some that are bassoon specific and some that I've just created on my own. So this is a separate handle that I purchased and put a drill bit inside of it. All the sizes are on a couple handouts on my website. But I'll go through and ream now before I open the reed, just to minimize the amount of torque that I push through, that I put into the reed. This reduces side slipping, I find, over time, as does this really quick, you can see this kind of quick rotating motion that I'm making, pairing it with not too much force inward. What that does is creates kind of like a sanding effect rather than having large pieces of cane. You can see it's sort of this powdery light cane that comes out. And that's more what I'm looking for. That just means that I'm not prying and kind of scraping the inside of the reed. And so I'll go through at the end of my rat tail file here. You can also use a pipe cleaner. Clean out that excess out of the middle. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this right now, but what I'm looking for in the center of the reed is a nice round throat. There we go. We saw just a little bit of it. A nice round open throat with high volume of air that I'll ultimately be able to put through this. So at this point I can tell if I've cracked the reed at any point, because there would be not a football shape there and not a circle shape through the tube, but it would have some sort of diamond quality to it if there's an internal crack or internal instability there. But it looks pretty good to me. It fits on the bocal pretty well. And at this point I measure. There are many things over years and years of reed making that we start to do just by eyeballing, and not necessarily that it's less accurate, but I've told students and colleagues before that I don't measure 5 millimeters anymore, because I just have memorized what 5 millimeters looks like, and 8 millimeters in between my two wires. I don't measure that quite so much anymore. I'll just spot check, and it's pretty spot on after hundreds and hundreds of reeds. But one thing that I do measure every time is where I'm going to clip. And so the measurements that I use for my clipped measurement, from the shortest end of the butt, if you have an uneven butt, should be 1 inch to the top wire. And then if I set my ruler on top of that top wire, I'm going to make a mark at 1 inch and 1/8. That's why I've got that little slider set up. This ends up being, if you're a millimeter person, this ends up being clipping at 27. That's what that'll do. So that puts my bottom wire, or my second wire rather, 18 millimeters. First wire 8 above that. And then from the collar up, we're also at 27. And so at this point, I don't use a guillotine. I use these big nail clippers. It's hardware store, $7. The only downside, I guess there are two downsides. The only downside is that you have to, if you have little tiny hands like mine, you have to get used to using this larger fulcrum. I don't use a smaller one because I want to be able to make one fell swoop. I want to be able to make one cut. And the other, so that's the one downside, is it can be a little bit awkward to get in your hand. The second downside is that it can be easy to make not an even cut. So rather than trying to line up something parallel that's now 1 inch and 1/8 away, right, I don't try to line up the parallel clippers with the top wire there. Instead, I look at the grains of the cane and I make a perpendicular cut. So I make a right angle between the grains of the cane and the seam. Clip right through that. And the first thing I'll do is take a look at what's going on with my aperture. Make sure that it's not something that looks too wonky. At this point, this can kind of be indicative of what's going on with the cane, or if I've done something improper in my forming process. Maybe I didn't quite do the cut back on the collar like I would want. But right now, I'm immediately gathering information about symmetry, top to bottom, left to right, so the 4 quadrants of the reed, do they look the same? And I'll actually go ahead and do a close test, a pinch test. Does the aperture really spiral close? And this one looks pretty good to me. All 4 quadrants collapse inward at approximately the same rate with the same amount of force. Now I will actually flip over and test both sides, not because I believe there's a top and a bottom to the reed, but because our sensitivity in our fingers is different from thumb to index finger, and as is the amount of force when we make that pinching motion. So it's just a way to double check and make sure that I'm not getting false information because my thumb is stronger than my index finger. But that looks pretty good to me. I'll drop that in water and go ahead and get my tools ready to go. I will, every time that I work in between reeds or in between every scraping session, make sure that I really clean off all the excess cane fibers from my knife, because quite a bit of my reading of how much cane is coming off of a reed is literally just looking what's left on the knife after I've done the scraping. So if I'm visually balancing some things. And this, I just soak enough to what I would want to play on and see what happens with the cane. So I'm doing visual assessment right now. I can see that the fibers are pretty big. It's a little bit difficult to see that on camera, but if you can see those individual little vascular bundles or the little dots of cane that look more dense than others, that can give you some information about how even the cane might be. I'm looking at how it's soaked up the water. I see that it's pretty fibrous, so I'm assuming at this point that this is a pretty soft piece of cane. I'm also looking at how springy it is. So this is pretty easy to push from the sides. And if it opens pretty easily, and you notice how when I push that from the cane, I'm not doing anything that really should change the structural integrity of how open that aperture is, but it likes to stay open and it doesn't spring back immediately, rather, which is not as quickly as I would like. So that's just reinforcing this is a softer piece of cane. And what I do with that knowledge is file it away to inform me of how much I can take away for each step. So at this point, I already know with a softer piece of cane that's a little bit more fibrous, I'm more likely to leave some more cane on there so that it counteracts that inherent flexibility. And I'm also more likely to go through with some sandpaper and sand the inside of a blade. So if I find my plaque here, I like to use a clear contra bassoon plaque because I can see the way the light casts through the reed if I hold up a light behind it. So I'm just double checking here, and I'll draw on the reed my first scrapes. I do a series of 3 angles on the first scrape of a reed, and ultimately what this does is creates that thumbnail shape that all of us are really striving for in the front. So instead of aiming for a curve, I use a set of straight lines, and what that does is creates is essentially the more straight lines that you create, the closer you get to there. It's a series of tangents along that curve. So my first one, and I'll use a razor blade here as my right angle so you can see what I'm talking about. If you're not comfortable with sticking a razor blade under your finger like this, or you can use a Post-it note or a corner of a sheet of paper, I put the tip of that corner right at the tip of the reed. And I don't draw on all of these all the time, but it's a great way of visualizing in your first go round, just darkening this so you can see it, where that first scrape is. That's the 90 degree, I call that the 90 degree scrape. And I'll go through and I'm going to do that on all 4 sides. And if you're a person that likes to use a micrometer, the amount that I take off is 50% of how much I need to take off totally. So if I know that those wings for me will be probably somewhere in the 40s by the time I'm done, maybe 30s, 35. I don't measure. I do a lot of clinical tests toward the clinical evaluation toward the end. So I don't aim for a specific number every time. But if I know that it's going to be at least 40 and I'm at 50 now, then what I'm going to do is take this down to 45. So halfway And what that does is allows the cane to rebound as it sort of recovers from the trauma of scraping. So I'm going to take down, you can also do this visually if I just take a look at the rails. I'm going to take those down halfway between where they are now and where I want my final rail to be. So I do an angled scrape along that 45-degree triangle. And you notice this very first scrape is not anything to do with the overall thickness. Part of this is because I like the reed to respond so I can know what's going on in the back, so I get some information pretty immediately. And part of it's because I'm familiar with my profiler and the way that I've got everything set up, and I know that that back is already within 10% of the ultimate thickness that I want it to be. So I've got my profiler pretty dialed in. If you're using cane that's profiled by somebody else that comes pretty thickly, or if you can't really adjust your profiler or aren't comfortable doing that and you know that it comes off and there's some thick reeds, then you might need to do a preliminary scrape that's a little bit further back in this first round. So I'm taking these down 50% toward my final measurement. It might be difficult to see, but you can see how that rail that's on my left side now is lighter than the one on the right side. And I've done just that triangle, and then I'll go through and do what I call a blending scrape. This is a scrape that a lot of younger reed makers, I don't necessarily mean younger in age, I mean younger in experience, skip is this step of blending because we're afraid of going over the heart. But ultimately, the vibrations need to travel through the reed, and so if there's a ledge anywhere, if there are any bumps anywhere, that stops the vibration. So I go and do this angle, and then I do a light pass, very, very light, to blend it. I do the same thing on the other side, 45 degree, to create the 90-degree triangle in the middle, rather. 90-degree triangle. The bulk of my cane comes off in those wings. degrees, bulk in the wings. And I'm using that angled scrape again. You notice that I'm rotating, and I have to remember that I can move both arms. Otherwise, it's easy to make one wing lighter than the other. And then you see I went right into a blending scrape. That feels a little bit like the chicken dance movement with your arms. I'm bringing my elbows in toward my body so that I get an even blending scrape across those. So when I look now, I should see rails that are about 50% lower. We can start to see a back to front taper happening. The rails in the back, and I'm assuming at this point, I'm presuming, right, that what happens with the rails is indicative of what's happening with the spine, because I haven't changed anything about the other dimensions of the reed. So we're starting to get a good back to front taper happening, and then with those 45-degree angles set up like they are for that total 90-degree triangle, I'm also starting to establish a really healthy side-to-side taper, which can be part of the reason in early reed scrapes, if you get a reed that's really responsive, you take that tip down quite a bit, or maybe you dig out the back third because you really want that low response to happen, but you haven't gone through and done these angled scrapes, then you're missing the side-to-side taper, and you only have the back to front, and what that does is gives you a highly responsive reed that doesn't have any focus. Remember, if the reed structure is focused, then the sound is going to be focused as well. The second scrape that I do to really reinforce that tip is bisecting the angle that I just did. So these are my real 45-degree triangles. Draw them in here. I know there are several videos floating around there that look really similar to this, and so if you layer, and the measurement is really similar too. This ends up being to me about 3 millimeters down the rail from the dead center to 3 millimeters. The first triangle is about 5 millimeters. So if you're a ruler user, which I highly recommend if this is new to you, 3 millimeters for the second triangle. It was 5 for the first. I'm going to go through and do the same thing. Nice angled scrape. And at this point, I want to hear and feel the sound of that knife on the end of the plaque. If you've been using the same plaque for a year or two and it's made out of plastic, you will have, I'll show you in just a minute, you will have a little divot in the plaque where you're gradually scraping away some of this plastic. If you have one of those metal plaques, then you'll notice that the metal is a different color here from where you've scraped away the top of it and it's a little bit darker and more matte toward the tip. That's actually part of the reason, other than just transparency, literal transparency, right, being able to see the light through the plaque, that I switched away from metal plaques to plastic plaques, is it just sounded to me like nails on a chalkboard. When I got my scraping technique really finessed, I would hear this and it just was driving me bonkers. So I like the more pleasant sound of the low plastic. Do the same thing on the other side. You notice the real finesse of this kind of scraping. It requires a sharp knife because we're right at the tip of the reed, and if your knife is dull, then the kind of cane that's going to come off won't look powdery like this. It'll look like it's peeling the cane, and what that means is you're digging in with your hand, either pressure pushing down through your hand or just the weight of your arm. That you've got a little bit of a high shoulder, a little bit of tension going on, pushing down to get that knife to scrape since it's not sharp enough, and that's where we run into the problems of ripping the corners off reeds and things like that, fraying the tip. You notice I did that, and now I'm going to go through and do one big blanket scrape to blend forward. I'll show you my plaque. I don't know if you can see that now. It's pretty see-through. right in the center. It's quite a bit thinner toward the middle than it was. But at this point, I double check my aperture. Starting to look a lot more open because I've relieved the pressure of that heavy cane. And at this point, I should have a crow, but remember I mentioned there are 3 steps in my first scrape. Number 1, 90-degree triangle. Number 2, that 45-degree triangle, so bisecting the first one. The other measurement for that, number 1 was 5 millimeters down the rail, 5 millimeters down the rail. Number 2 was 3 millimeters down the rail. Number 3 is 1 millimeter. This is where you'll really get yourself in a world of hurt if you don't have a sharp knife. At this point, you could do this with a file as well, but keep in mind that the more dull the material you use toward the very tip of the reed, the more dull the sound will be. So sometimes I'll do this with a file or sandpaper very intentionally in order to subdue a really bright or really buzzy reed, or I'll go back over a reed that's already been finished and really sharpen up that edge with a sharper surface to get a sharper sound. Not sharper in terms of pitch, but a little more precise, a little more crisp. So I'm going to start out with a knife here and just do that front millimeter. Remember, number 1 was 5 millimeters, number 2 is 3 millimeters, number 3 is 1 millimeter. Or if you like to think in angles, number 1 was wide, 2, mama bear, 3, baby bear. There's a straight line directly across the tip of the reed. This doesn't take very much cane at all, but what I'm doing is getting that response to work. First millimeter. And then at this point, I'll just go through and look visually. Have I been unbalanced? And indeed I have. I've got one rail that was a little bit more carved down than the others. So I'm looking for balance and I'm looking for bumps. Do I have any places where I've accidentally created a bump for the vibration to have to travel through? I'm still at about 50%. I've done that blending stroke, and then I'll go through, usually with sandpaper. This is a wet dry 500 grit, and just buff the surface of the reed. This gets rid of some of the bumps. It smooths out some of that tip area. It also just makes it nice to play on, right? It feels nicer on your mouth and on your embouchure than something that's a really fuzzy surface. And as I mentioned before, because this is a little bit more fibrous cane, I'm going to go ahead and do a pass where I slide the sandpaper in between the blades and just get out some of that extra wet, gooey cane from the inside. This was a piece that had a little more, the cut that the gouge took was a little closer to the pith of the cane. So I'll dip this reed in. There's my starting crow, and all I've done is put a tip in the reed. So at this point, you should be able to get a crow, and you should be able to get a sound. So let's see what this guy sounds like. I'll go ahead and get my bassoon here. I'm expecting it to be, or what I want it to be rather, I want it to be maybe a little bit loud. I want it to be pretty responsive, and I'm okay if it's a little bit flat. Makes sense that that low response is not quite as spot on as I would want it because I haven't done anything else other than just put the very tip in. And remember, I did only put it to 50%. So this is halfway to its final measurement. And at this point, I will let the reed sit for probably, my next little email session, my next little office work section. And then I'll play it for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, give it a good play in. And then tomorrow is when I'll start on the second scrape, which is in the second scrape video already. So there's a crash course in my first scrape process. Remember, there were 3 steps. You can think of them in 2 different ways. One is with the angles, 90 degree, 45 degree, 0 degree, step 1, 2, 3. Or you can think of them in terms of measurements along the rails, 5 millimeters to the tip, 3 millimeters to the tip, or 1 millimeter directly across the tip. And that gets you your very first scrape.